Welcome to our Learn Community Education webinar. I'm Tina Barnett, and I am the newest board member of Learn. So I'm really excited to be here and helping Dee. And today our topic is peaceful death, another option. So for those of you that are new to Learn, what is Learn? Learn is Lifelong Education and Aging Resource Network, and it's an Idaho-based nonprofit organization with a mission to provide community education on aging and caregiving topics. Learn is a leaders network of the Society of Certified Senior Advisors. SCSA is an organization that educates and certifies professionals who work with seniors. This presentation today contains information about difficult issues. We'd ask that you please listen and view responsibly and respectfully. This content is provided for general information purposes only and is not to be considered legal, financial, or health advice. Learn provides access to a broad range of resources and information related to aging and caregiving topics. Learn does not take a position on any of our educational topics. Please consult with your legal, financial, healthcare, or other service providers before taking action based on this information. So without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to be here today giving you this great content for free. I'd like to give a shout out first to Oasis Senior Advisors. They provide free personal senior living assistance with trusted local advisors. They can guide you as you search for senior living options. And also A Mind for All Seasons. They lead the revolution in brain health for individuals and institutions with their comprehensive approach to brain health and healing. And much thanks to both of those sponsors for sponsoring our spring 2022 webinar schedule. So I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Jim Van Buskirk. Jim has co-hosted a regular Death Cafe for over 5 years and has volunteered as a regional coordinator with Final Exit Network for over 3 years. He frequently facilitates literary discussions and presents public programs on topics related to family secrets and Jewish film and/or queer history at the Jewish Community Library, the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco, the Peninsula Jewish Community Center, San Francisco Public Library, and other locations throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. Jim currently works as a book group facilitator, writer, editor, public speaker, exhibition curator, and collections manager. His writing has been featured in various newspapers, magazines, anthologies, websites, blogs, and radio broadcasts. And for more information about Jim, you can go to his website, which you'll find at jimvanbuskirk.com. So Jim, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to allow you to just do your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks for the invitation. And just to get a sense of, since there's so few of us, I want to make this as interactive and as helpful for you as possible. But let me just tell you a little bit more about how I got into this. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of Death Cafe, but it's a wonderful social franchise based in London that started in 2011, and it's people coming together in the real world over tea and cookies, less so in the virtual world, but people talking about various aspects of the stigmatized topic of death. And it's very interesting. People bring questions, resources, fears, beliefs, and there's no program or product or proselytizing. It's just something that like-minded people attend. So with a couple of friends, I had been doing that for quite some time, and I met a wonderful woman in her 80s, and we got to know each other, not well, but she was a Jungian psychologist and an author and just a really dynamic character. And one day she called me and said, Jim, I've contacted Final Exit Network. I've applied for services, I've been accepted, and the exit guides are coming on Monday afternoon. Would you be with me? And I was kind of blown away. I had heard of Final Exit Network. I didn't really know much about them. I didn't know what being with her at the very end would entail, but I agreed. I was honored and I thought, okay. And I immediately contacted her exit guides to find out, well, is there legal risk at this? What's going to happen? What if I don't have what it takes? What to expect? And they were so professional and patient and compassionate, not only with me, but when I got there, she asked me to come a little early so we could hang out. And then they came and they were incredible. And so I was with her as she took her final exhale with a smile on her face. And I couldn't get home fast enough to join the organization. And I was so moved that I wrote an article about it. And it ended up on the cover of the magazine. And as a result of that, I met another woman and was with her at her hastened death. And then I was invited to act as coordinator. And so I've been doing that for 3 years. And my territory is Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado. So when anyone from those states contact me or contact the organization, either via phone or email, I'm the one that calls them back and says what's going on. And so you, as you might imagine, these are pretty heartfelt conversations. Um, People struggling to figure out what their options are. And I would say about 85% of the time, I directed them to some resources, as I'm about to do with you, and I don't ever hear back from them. They have gotten what they want, or I have been able to hear them or listen to them or tell them that I don't think they're crazy. Um, and that brings them enough solace. And I have no idea whether they move forward, whether they're satisfied, whether their health condition improves. I don't know anything. But I do know that in that very temporary, very intense interaction, I have managed to give them something, and they all always express incredible gratitude for just knowing what their options are. So I'll just segue right into my presentation, and I don't know if you've uh, gone to the finalexitnetwork.org website, but there's a lot of really interesting, really important information. Um, so I encourage you to do that. And one of the first things I refer people to is a sheet we put together called Options for Hastening Death. And I'll just run through it quickly. The first is rather passive. It's to refuse medical treatment. The second is voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. We list the clinics in Switzerland, which are set up to help people hasten their death. We refer to medical aid in dying for those people who live in states with physician-assisted dying. And we refer people to two published resources. One, Derek Humphrey's Final Exit, which he wrote, I think, first in the 90s and has gone into a third edition and actually a fourth electronic edition, Final Exit 2020. And then another resource called the Peaceful Pill Handbook, put out by Philip Nietzsche and Exit International. And then I talk a little bit about FEN's support services. So FEN's vision is that any competent person unbearably suffering an intractable medical condition has the option to die legally and peacefully. So we believe that what we do, which is provide information and support and nothing else, we don't publish books, we don't provide equipment, we don't touch equipment, is legal. And so the person themselves has the right to hasten their own death. And the way it starts is we recommend if somebody thinks they want to go in that direction, we suggest that they initiate an application when they think they're within about a year of wanting to exit. So sometimes people call and say, well, I'm doing okay now, but I like to plan ahead. So I'm looking 3 to 5 years out. And we've found that way too much can shift in that amount of time. So we urge them to get their ducks in order, but to call us back. Other people call and say, I cannot take it one day longer. Can you come tomorrow afternoon? And the answer is unfortunately no. We're not an emergency organization where our volunteers are spread all across the country. Um, so then I walk them through our application process, and the process itself can take about 6 to 8 weeks because we use telephone and snail mail to protect their privacy and the organization's privacy as well. So it starts with a letter from the applicant saying what their situation is, what their health crisis might be, what their quality of life, anything that they think captures their current situation. And that's augmented with medical records. So a recent physical, a specialist, a diagnosis, not every office visit ever made. And they snail mail that to me as their regional coordinator. And then I arrange for another volunteer to interview them. And the interview is pretty in depth. It wants to know, is there a date in mind? Are there pets involved? Is there a space in mind? Who has access to that space? What day does the cleaning lady come? What about friends, family, and physicians? Who in the circle is aware of the plan? Who needs to be aware of the plan? Who doesn't need to be aware of the plan? Religious background, physical ability. The three physical aspects that are required are being able to raise one's hands over one's head as if you're shampooing. Another is to be able to screw the canister as if one's removing a lid. And the third is to have enough manual dexterity as if one's buttoning or unbuttoning a button, but to actually assemble the equipment. And then once I've received the report from the interview, I assemble all that material and send it to our medical evaluation committee, which is a team of 3 physicians who will never have met the person or even talked to them on the phone. And they review the paperwork and they make one of 3 determinations. Yes, this application is accepted for exit guide assignment. Or 2, we need a little bit more information. We need another report. We need a letter from a specialist. We need this test. We want to be absolutely sure of that this person has exhausted their treatment options, or that everything is as it seems. And then the third is my least favorite part of the job, which is, I'm sorry, we cannot approve this application. And then I have to call the person back and tell them that it has nothing to do with their quality of life. They're the only person who can evaluate that, but it's more risk management for our organization, so that there may be dysfunctional family communication, there may be some red flag somewhere that we don't want to put ourselves or them at risk. So if their application has been accepted, and then I find an exit guide available to work with them. And as I say, we are volunteers all across the country. So it might be someone in their town, or it may be somewhere in another part of the country that flies across the country. And they will call the person, interview them again. And if they don't see any red flags, they will send them an equipment list. And once the person has purchased all the equipment, they call the guide. The guide will make a site visit show them how to assemble anything. And I just remember with my friend Margaret, the first woman who introduced me to Fen, her attention, she was rattled. She said, I just can't do this. I can't see well enough. My dexterity is bad. Can't you help me? Can't you do this? No, let's just take a deep breath. Let's start over. And they were very patient, but they would not touch anything. So she managed to create a hood. And when the time comes, the person has attached the tubing to the hood, to the regulator, to the canister, to the adapter. And if and when the time comes, they pull the hood over the head. They continue breathing normally and naturally. I should have said that the canister is filled with nitrogen. It used to be that we recommended helium, but helium is no longer available. It's being cut with oxygen and won't do the job. So party balloon helium will not work. So they get a canister of nitrogen and they pull the hood down. They continue to breathe normally and naturally, but they're breathing nitrogen, and they lose consciousness in about 30 seconds, and the canister empties and the body lets go after about 10 or 15 minutes. So it's peaceful, it's painless, and it's foolproof. So that's the modality that we support. It's completely doable on one's own with instructions in the Peaceful Pill Handbook and Final Exit 2020. What Final Exit Network offers is the experience and expertise of our exit guide. So these are people who have been trained, who have been at many exits and can do troubleshooting. So is the valve working? Is there enough nitrogen? Is all kinds of details. Because the one thing I tell everyone I talk to, whatever modality they're considering, make 100% certain that they are going to be 100% successful. Because many times people have called me back and said, I can't take it. I tried to slit my wrists and it didn't work. Or I took all the pills in my medicine cabinet and I'm still here. Or other more horrific stories. So they end up incapacitated, incarcerated, institutionalized, all the things that they were trying to avoid. So that's why the resources that we recommend people look at are so important. So, I mean, I have a lot more I can say, but why don't I stop there? That's sort of the basics, and ask if you have questions or particular areas that you want me to try to address.
Well, I mean, I'd like to know more about Death Cafe, sort of on the front end of the conversation. And I think that that's been a big part of the movement, but I don't really understand how those work, how you would form one if you wanted to participate in your community.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. That's a good question, and I think they're marvelous. There's a website, deathcafe.com, that explains exactly what it is. It has guidelines if one wants to start one, which is what I and my friends did. We attended one, and it was across a bridge in heavy traffic, and we all lived in San Francisco, and we said, well, this is crazy, and we couldn't find one in San Francisco. You can put in your zip code and say, where's the closest one to me? And there weren't any. And so we said, well, we can do this. And with no training, no expertise, we started it not knowing if anyone would show up. And we found that people were absolutely starving for a safe space to talk about the stigmatized topic. And I was afraid, oh, well, you know, there's going to be weirdos coming out of the woodwork. And everyone was completely authentic. No one took up more than their share of the space. People had serious concern. They shared resources. Some people had never discussed any aspect of mortality with anyone, and others had been hospice nurses or had family members die more than once. Some people shared their near-death experiences. Some people talked about their advanced care directives. Some people were dealing with clutter. Some communicated with the other side. I mean, it was all across the board. And it was absolutely fascinating. And people look at me like I'm nuts when I say this, but it was lots of fun because there was there were a few tiers. It's not set up as a specifically as a grieving support group, but of course there are people sharing their feelings. But mostly we laughed, and not the nervous, awkward laughter that sometimes erupts, but really a genuine laughter. We're all in the same boat. We're all going the same direction. We don't know when or where or how. And we could laugh at ourselves and be ridiculous, as if we see how ridiculous some of us were in our belief systems. And you could see energy shift in the course of a 90-minute death cafe where people like, wow, I never thought about that. Or, oh, I didn't know that existed. Or, and you could just see the light bulb. And so, and I believe that that information, that change in consciousness, if you will, permeated beyond the confines of the physical space that we were in. And if and when we're able to have death cafes in person again, they're always augmented with a cup of tea and a cookie or a cake, or to emphasize the sweetness of life and our corporeality. So it's an amazingly simple, straightforward uh, option, and so much can be accomplished. So thanks for letting me get on the Death Cafe soapbox.
Well, thank you. And if anyone else has a question, please step up, or if you even want to type it into the chat, feel free to do that, and I can read your question if you. I think Arlene was maybe in a space where she couldn't maybe get on her mic. So yeah, feel free to do it that way. Well, interesting. Thank you. Continue with.
Well, one thing that occurred to me as I was preparing for this is, I don't know if you all noticed that, of course, Idaho does not have medical aid in dying now, but Oregon just reduced its residency requirements.
Oh.
So I was thinking that interested people could conceivably take advantage of medical aid in dying in Oregon, and or Montana for that matter. So California has its protocol based on the Oregon and the Washington, and I think there are now 11 states that have it. So depending on how long it takes Idaho to get medical aid in dying. And I should say that medical aid in dying is a completely different parallel universe. So those states require residency, 18 years of old, mental competency, 2 physician signatures, a terminal diagnosis, and a 6-month prognosis. So that's a lot of criteria to meet. And then should the person qualify, then the physician writes the prescription. And I've had cases where physicians would refuse to fill the prescription. So finding like-minded physicians or pharmacists can be a challenge. But if that all goes smoothly, I think it's called DDMA, and I can't remember now what the 4 compounds are, and they're taken in a certain sequence over a certain amount of time. But the important thing is the person has to be able to lift the cup to their lips, and they have to be able to swallow. Their GI tract needs to work so that the medical medicines, the compounds, can be absorbed. So that's not always possible, or it's not possible to foresee. I remember hearing about one story about a fellow who was waiting and waiting for his daughter to be able to fly in to be with him, and overnight he lost his ability to swallow and was not going to be able to move forward with his wishes. The criteria that Final Exit Network uses is a little broader, so that we are able to support people with degenerative diseases like ALS or Parkinson's. Um, we we can very carefully deal with people with cognitive decline like Alzheimer's. Um, Mental illness is still really challenging. We have to be really careful. And we also have what we call a constellation of conditions. So I remember some years ago, I got a call from a 92-year-old woman, and she said, I'm going blind, and I'm a painter and a voracious reader, and I don't want to spend my final days in darkness. And I said, well, Audrey, is there anything else wrong with you? And she snapped back, I wish there was. And I said, well, I'll happy to help you with your application, but I'm not sure losing your eyesight is going to qualify you for our support services. But by the time she pulled it together, she had what we call a constellation of conditions. So she couldn't drive at night, and she couldn't do this, and she couldn't do this, and she couldn't do this. None of which was serious enough, but when we added them together, it qualified her. And so we're approaching a category that we call a completed life or rational old age suicide, so that people can self-determine. I'm working with a woman now who is 89, nothing all that terrible wrong with her. And she said, I want to give myself a 90th birthday present. I want to move on. So again, the medical evaluation committee was able to read her statement, look at her records, and she's now working with an exit guide to do just that. So I see
Yeah, but
there's
yeah, I was going to read the question from
great,
Arlene.
thank you.
So her first one is she's wondering about how easy it is to get a canister of nitrogen, but she also started as a death and cupcakes where she lived before, and now wants to start a death and cupcakes in a local senior center, where I find as a death doula, I think the participants are underserved in this information, very much so. So, obviously she's got a very strong interest in this topic, and has a particular question about specifics on the nitrogen.
Right. And as I say, the Final Exit Network doesn't supply nitrogen, but I think it's used in welding, it's used in brewing beer, it's used in a variety of sources. So I would start with a big hardware store and just ask where one would get it. And if they can't refer the internet, there are some online sources, but we're starting to notice some supply chain problems where either the canister isn't sent, or it isn't sent completely full. So then they have the canister, then they have to go. And of course, these are people seeking to hasten their own death. So they're not at their best, either cognitively or physically or even emotionally. But one of the people that I was with when she exited, they were badgering her and said, well, what do you need this nitrogen for? And it's none of anybody's business what the nitrogen is for. So I told her to fib and say, oh, her nephew was working on a science project and needed it, and she was just helping him acquire it. So and I think the Peaceful Pill Handbook has some resources for where to acquire nitrogen, but it's an international publication, so it may not be as useful as it might be. But depending on where one is, I think it can be acquired locally. And
And
go ahead.
I guess the question that I have, is the oxygen been added to the helium in response to people using it?
I don't believe so. What my impression is that helium became scarce,
Mm.
which didn't quite make sense to me, but that's why they were cutting it with, I think it was about 80% helium and 20% oxygen. So no, I don't think it's what it might have looked like. But I also wanted to address Arlene's other question as a death doula. Arlene, you might be interested in this. Final Exit Network is just starting a training program to tell death doulas about Final Exit Network and about people's options for hastening their own death. So if you go to finalexitnetwork.org, I think they put it up there, and if they haven't, you can contact them and someone will get back to you about that program, because you might know everything you need to know, but you might be interested in sharing it with colleagues. And I do get questions from time to time. Some of the people I work with want to know if there's a death doula in their area, and there, as Arlene likely knows, there's a national network of death doulas, and so I point them to that. And it's got to be a good fit. And there's, maybe Arlene could speak to this, actually, I'd love to know, but it seems like death doulas offer a variety of services for a variety of fees in a variety of ways. So it seems like matching up the two, it sort of seems like it would be like finding a psychotherapist or any kind of counselor. Arlene, can you speak to any of that? Aha. So yeah. So Arlene's a volunteer, and there are some who do it for profit, and I imagine it's a wide range of experience and expertise. Thank you. And I'm wondering, so Death and Cupcake sounds like a variation on the Death Cafe theme, and pretty, do I want to say strict? They'd like you to follow the Death Cafe model. So if it veers from that too far, people come up with another name like Death and Cupcakes, and then they have a little more latitude in having it go the way they want to. Any other questions I can address? Let's see, what do I want to? A lot to talk about. But I was hoping for some guidance to see what people might be interested in. Tina, do you have any?
Well, I mean, it would be interesting to know some of the, maybe throw out a couple of the topics that you could go for, and we can pick a direction from that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I found interesting, because I was totally uninformed about the Right to Die movement, is that it's relatively recent, that it started in the 1970s, basically with the advent of the ventilator, that before people could be kept alive, they died. And then it was only after this new technology that people realized, wait, I don't want to be alive, or I may not want to be alive. So it was in 1980 that Derek Humphrey founded the Hemlock Society in Los Angeles. And that same year, the World Federation of Right to Die Societies was formed, with 27 organizations in 18 countries. And in 1991, as I said, he published the first edition of Final Exit, the subtitle of which was The Practicalities of Self-Deliverance and Assisted Suicide for the Dying. And it became a bestseller, one of the 25 most influential books, and not without its level of controversy. And then in 2003, the Hemlock Society changed its name to End of Life Choices, and that caused some controversy within the organization. And so End of Life Choices merged with Compassion in Dying to become Compassion and Choices. And then there were people on the End of Life Choices committee, the board members, who decided to form Final Exit Network. And as far as we know, we are the only organization that provides site-specific, one-to-one support for people seeking to hasten their death, or self-deliver, as we sometimes refer to it. And
So Jim, does that mean that so the one-on-one means the volunteer, the Final Exit Network volunteer is there, they speak, they don't touch any of the equipment, but you stay there through the whole process?
if the person wants that. Sometimes people say, oh no, I don't want a stranger with me. So I'd like them to come and show me how to set it up and then go away. Or they can say, my spouse is not supportive of this, or I have no support system. Could they be with me at the time of the exit and the exit guide? And the guides usually come in pairs, with a senior guide who has more experience and an associate guide who's being trained. And so they come together and they are with the person at the time of the exit, if that's what's desired.
And are there different penalties for suicide, and is that a state to state?
It's a state to state, but as far as we know, there's no penalty for someone committing suicide. What becomes problematic and potentially risky is the extent or the interpretation of someone's support. So there are those, I imagine, who would think that it's inappropriate for me to be talking to you and giving you information, even though I'm not assisting, I'm not helping, I'm not doing anything, but I'm giving information. So our legal counsel has listed all the verbiage for all the states, and it's all a little bit different, but it seems like it boils down to who wants to cause trouble, who, for either political aspirations or religious beliefs or whatever their motivation, wants to get in the way and either prevent somebody from realizing their goal, and or penalizing or incarcerating one of our volunteers for having supported that person to get to where they wanted to go. So we've had cases where, in fact, we're involved in a case now in Minnesota where exit guides were working with a woman, and they showed up and her husband had alerted the police, and they confiscated materials, not any exit materials, but just the guide's personal backpacks. So and what I often tell people is, I talked to one person who says, well, I'm a quadriplegic, I couldn't be able to turn this and that. And his wife said, oh, well, I'll help you. And he said, no, I don't want to put her at risk, because if she touched anything and anyone found out about it, she could conceivably be putting herself at risk. So it's complicated, and each case, each situation is totally unique and individual.
Thank you.
You're asking great questions, Tina. Keep at it.
Well, I have another one. So, as Idahoans, and, the availability of, or accessibility of Oregon, and a different set of laws. But, what I've read about Oregon is that even if that doctors aren't really participating in this process unless they've had a long-term relationship with a patient, that it's really not something that you can move there and find a doctor that's going to be willing to shepherd you through the process. So I guess that the question that I have under those conditions, say, is it a better state as far as understanding the process and allowing people to self determine? Is that self-determined? What was the terminology? Self-determined?
Well, there's a whole bunch of them. Let me just confuse you. So there's position. Well, we use self-deliverance,
Self-deliverance.
self-determined death, self-arranged death, self-managed, self-organized, self-regulated, self-controlled.
Mm-hmm.
We do disambiguate, or try to anyway, between someone hastening their own death and suicide.
Okay.
And it's a subtle distinction, and it's lost on many people, but I do think there are some differences. But
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. I talk to many people who say, well, my children live in California, I'm just going to get myself to California. Well, establishing residency, finding not one but two physicians when one is probably not at one's very best, seems way more challenging than is feasible. And similarly with the clinics in Switzerland, the most famous of which is Dignitas, but there's also Pegasus and a couple of others. It's expensive. I think they charge about $10,000 plus the fare, plus someone has to go with you. And I mean, I hate flying to begin with, but if I'm in my final months, I don't think I could get myself through an airport and onto a plane and to this clinic. And so some of these options start to not be quite as realistic as we might want them to be.
And how do you think that that there's a movement afoot? Do you think that, like, project 10 years out, do you think that in this country that there will be a loosening or an acceptance of this sort of thing? Or I guess that's a pretty broad statement considering how different we are from one state to the next. But
yeah, well, and it's interesting because as I said, my states are Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado. And I hope I'm wrong. So two of my states, Colorado has medical aid in dying, and New Mexico just last summer initiated their legislation. And in fact, a dear friend of mine was one of the first people to take advantage of it. And he knew what he wanted, and his physicians were supportive, and he got the cocktail, and he's gone. So the other states, Texas and Arizona, I don't know if they will ever be able to pass a right to die movement. There's a wonderful book called Scripting Death. I think I have it in my notes, by Mara Bookbinder. And it's Scripting Death, Stories of Assisted Dying in America. And what she does is focus on the implementation in Vermont of their 2013 legislation, which is called Patient Choice and Control at End of Life Act. So each state names it differently. They name it for someone, or they change the terminology. But a bookbinder looks at all the elements, the religious arguments, the medical arguments, the politicians, the lawyers, the advocates, the opposition, looking at all the moving parts and why all these, Massachusetts has been trying for years to get theirs pushed through, and they just keep encountering roadblocks one after another. But the proponents are dedicated and committed, and I'm confident that eventually they will be able to get it through. And in some cases, what would be nice, I don't think it's going to happen, is have a national right to die legislation, and then this would be moot. But I or my potential clients often invoke the controversy over abortion. So who can tell people what they can and can't do with their body, whether it's at the beginning of a life or at the end of a life. So there are those who would um, take that responsibility. The other thing is, so you mentioned that physicians may not want to be involved, and I mentioned pharmacists and even hospice, depending on if it's a Catholic-run hospice or some other religious organization, they may or may not support someone's uh, choosing to end their life. So if someone says, you know what, I'm going to stop eating and drinking, um, they they might say no, not here, you're not, or not under our watch. So it gets very complicated very quickly, and it seems like it shouldn't be. And most, as I said, most of my callers are very appreciative, but some get really frustrated. Why isn't there a peaceful pill? Why is this so complicated? Why do I have to jump through all these hoops? And it's just because this is the here and now of the United States and America. There's another book that I recommend to show how it could be different. Um, this is a brand new memoir by Stephanie Green called "This is Assisted Dying: A Doctor's Story of Empowering Patients at the End of Life." And Stephanie Green was a physician dealing with childbirth in Canada, and then decided to shift gears and began helping people with medically assisted dying in Canada. Completely different situation. I mean, not to have neighbor envy, but they know how to do it. Not to say that it's not without challenges, but her book is so well written and so empathic, and shows us how things could be otherwise in this country.
What's interesting to me is to wonder about what affects the change or the big demographic bubble that's coming. And we're kind of in it now with the aging population. I mean, to me, that would seem like a good thing as far as this changing the attitudes about. And I don't know if you've noticed that, or if there's been any movements that align with that.
Yes, I think you're right that as the boomers age, we're going to be more insistent on what we want and what we don't want. Um, and the Final Exit Network does some amount of advocacy, but I think even more uh, prominent in those arenas are Compassion and Choices and Death with Dignity, because they don't provide the one-on-one support services we do, so they can focus on things in the political arena, again, using probably Oregon as a model. The other thing that I would recommend uh, is to people make sure that they have their advanced care directive, that they've identified a healthcare proxy. And one of the things that I learned recently, my brother is a palliative care physician and his son is a new physician. And I'm about to turn 70 and I'm in good health. And they said, oh, you need a POLST. A what? So POLST, physician orders life-sustaining treatment. So I said, I thought that was only for old people and sick people. No, no, they said, you need this. Okay. So I called my doctor, made an appointment, and the intake nurse said, well, what are you here for? And I said, oh, I want a POLST. And like me, she said, well, how do you spell it? What is it? So I informed her. Then the social worker came in and said, oh, you don't need a pulse. Those are for old people and sick people. I said, well, that's what I thought, but my physician brother says no. So I'm here and I want one. And it's very simple and straightforward. In fact, hang on a second. I'll go get mine off the refrigerator. So it's a hot pink form, and it can be acquired at the doctor's office, because they have to sign it. So it's not something you can just download and sign and have a witness. It needs to be in your record and they need to have signed it. But it's really just three statements: CPR, yes or no; medical intervention, full, selective, or comfort focused; and artificially administered nutrition, long-term trial or no. So it's pretty straightforward. So I had looked at it, made my decision, and the social worker was all but arguing with me. Well, are you sure? Well, you can change this down the road. Like, I told her I was a right to life advocate. I My English skills are pretty good. My cognitive skills are okay, and I'm fairly assertive. I thought, wow, if she's giving me such a hard time, what if somebody with a different skill set comes in? So I wrote to the medical company and said, your staff needs more training. And so the physician came in, wouldn't even look me in the eyes, reluctantly signed it. Off it went. I did whatever I needed to do with him. And then I was leaving and I said, well, where's my post? Well, she had gone off to make photocopies. Because it's on hot pink paper, the photocopies were completely illegible and useless. So I just felt like everybody needs more training. We as patients need to be much, much, much more assertive than we thought we needed to be. And the physicians and the nurses and the hospice workers, everybody needs to be trained in this arena.
Well,
And go ahead.
I was just going to share, Jim, I was able to come back that, as an advocate family caregiver, we just recently went through this with my father-in-law who he's in late stage kidney failure and is not even in the position where you are of being healthy, right? He is exactly the reason a post is created. He's a 20-year heart patient with kidney failure, et cetera, and he has very clear ideas of what he does and does not want. In the state of Idaho, it's a post, not a post.
Whoa, okay.
It's a post, and we needed to. I had reviewed it with him, so he knew what it was for. And the important distinction is the post, as a physician's order, is the only thing that will stop a first responder from treating you. And for my father-in-law, that was very important because he lives alone and it's very possible he will have an event that someone may find him or discover and call for help. And without that post being on his refrigerator, on the back of the front door, by his bed, we have it everywhere. Without it being there, he would receive treatment he does not want because legally they are required to provide it unless there is a post. And the post is the only document that will work outside of a healthcare institution. And so we had this conversation very intentionally with my father-in-law. He had made his choices very thoughtfully. But then we got to the point where when we called the doctor, she wouldn't do it because she said she doesn't do those. And it was a hospitalist. And she said, you need to talk to the specialist. And I said, I don't need to talk to a specialist. Any doctor can do this. So ultimately, my husband navigated through to the nephrologist and we made an appointment, and the nephrologist did it without, he clearly understood as soon as we sat down. We knew what we were talking about. We knew what we wanted. But I then did exactly what you did. And I wrote the letter to the health system and said, additional training is needed because the hospitalist didn't think she could do this, and she has absolutely she should do this, especially in this situation. No additional counseling. Oftentimes they will want to make sure that people have capacity, that they have been educated, that they do have the English language skills and everything else to make the decisions as you described. But it was just lack of understanding and lack of knowledge. And so, whether you're the physician needing to understand it, the patient wanting to understand it, or the family caregiver, advocacy for yourself and your loved one is so critical.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you all work together to make it happen, because somebody could just say, I'm not feeling well, let's deal with something else. And that also brings up another important point, is the healthcare proxy, because one really needs an advocate there. if something happens and the person can't communicate their needs, somebody who has had multiple conversations, he does want this, he doesn't want this. I know we've talked about it 12 times. And those are challenging conversations many times. And it's not just one off, it's, are you
It's
sure?
not one conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. And I tell my father-in-law, my husband is his healthcare proxy. I am the consultant, right, with my background. But one of the things that I always say to him, we have a conversation after every new medical discovery and every new medical event. And, he is very clear on what he wants today. And I tell him, great, it's documented that way. And I will ask you again when we get to that next, because the big one for us is he says he does not want dialysis. And I respect that. But I told him I will ask him one more time. And that will be the day that the doctor tells him he must have dialysis or he is essentially an end stage renal failure, entering hospice, et cetera. And I told him I will ask him that one more time, not because I don't believe him today, but because he has the right to change his mind when he receives new information and a new diagnosis. And he can't possibly know how he will feel once he's at that point. And so we've actually just made this a family conversation. We are managing very chronic, serious conditions. And every time we have new information, we revisit the conversation. And if that means I need to change the post, okay, then I will change it. But it's just everybody says we talk about death at the dinner table. And I said, yes, we do.
Well, that's admirable. And I hope he realizes how fortunate he is to have you as his advocate, because as I said many times, I talk to people who, for whatever reason, are totally isolated, have no support system, or their loved ones, their family and friends are not supportive. I mean, I've had more than one where the spouse was, no, not only do I not want you to do this, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen. Um, so choosing, and I wrestled with who to choose for my healthcare proxy, because my partner is wonderful, but he's not the most assertive person in the world. And I want somebody who's going to argue with the physician and say, no, it says right here, he doesn't want that. And so I got Alan to say, yes, I know I can be passive. No, I know I don't like conflict, but if it's on your behalf, I will rise to the occasion and you can count on me. So that's what I needed to hear. And we did our advanced care directives. We also, there's so many advanced care directives, and we didn't know which form to use. So we picked the one that the medical system that I'm in uses. I thought, well, that way the physicians will be familiar with it. They'll know where to look. It'll be on file. But as you say, if the post isn't available, the 911 EMT team is legally obligated to do everything. And sometimes, even if you are waving a post at them, they will do everything. Oh, no, my boss says I have to do this. Oh, I'm religious.
fear
Yeah,
or personal point of view. But
right.
oftentimes it's fear. They're afraid. It is a really tough, it is a tough situation to be in. And when I work with families and help them think through these issues as they make these choices sometimes. And I often counsel people, as you have said, you really need to be thoughtful about who that healthcare proxy is. And sometimes it's not the person that society would say. It's not necessarily the spouse or the oldest child or, whatever the case may be. And you really do need to have somebody who can do that. And it's a family conversation for somebody to recognize that maybe they aren't the best person. And they might not love the answer, but ultimately you want your voice to be heard.
Right. And that's exactly, thank you for making that point, because this is only about you. It's not about anybody else. And I remember one story a woman told, and she did not want to name her daughter. she thought her daughter would be way too emotional, not rise to the occasion. So she ended up naming her next door neighbor, who she knew would be there for her. So as you say, it's not necessarily who it looks like it should be.
Well, and I had a client who the children all absolutely believed that they could do it and would do a good job. And I think in my conference with them, I think they probably all would. But he, based on his own life experiences, didn't want them to have any lingering worry or guilt or anything like that. And he didn't want to put them in that position. And so he made a different choice. And actually, he ended up choosing a family member, but it was a granddaughter who was recently named. She went through medical school, so she was a new physician. He felt that she had the background, had enough of a relationship, knew the family would handle it well, but wasn't the child. And I thought it was a really brave decision. His children didn't love it, but I supported it. I thought it was a brave and thoughtful and appropriate decision for him.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that Final Exit Network has in our resources online is one, how to talk about death, and then two, we've identified books and films and documentaries that deal with some aspect of hastening one's own death in certain circumstances. And what we found and what we hope is that having something outside the personal situation, oh, see what she did in the movie, that's what I want to do. Or see what happened there, that's what I don't want to have happen to me. And that way it sort of removes it, makes it a little less emotionally invested for the people involved. But as you say, you have to continue the conversation again and again and again. And of course, it's not necessarily pleasant, but if it isn't updated repeatedly, and then a crisis occurs,
Well,
everyone.
then it can be questioned as well because
Exactly.
it's not new enough. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Or you question yourself. Well,
mhm.
I'm pretty sure he said that to me 5 years ago, and so I think you're modeling exactly the right behavior.
So I think I am really interested, and we'll spend some time looking at those resources on your website, because I think the examples of what it looks like is really important, because in our society and in our culture, very few people know what it looks like, at what end of life looks like. And very few people have, in it, since we took the parlor out of our homes, very few people know what death looks like, right? And so I think that giving people a frame of reference to make a decision is really helpful, because without that understanding, it's an imagination of what it could be. And so I plan to go look at those resources. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I try to look at everything that comes out, um, and I think that some of the most powerful on there on our list are the ones that are documentaries about voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And when I mention that as an option to some people, they're like, absolutely not. I'd rather take a handgun out to the back 40. No way. But I think if you look at, and it can be uncomfortable and it's not to be done on one's own, granted. But I think if you look at these documentaries made by family members, you see that this might or might not be a viable option for some people. So I think, as we've said from the beginning, just knowing what the options are, uh, sharing information, sharing resources, it's what's important, and everyone will make their own decision. But we designed a T-shirt for our Death Cafe, and our tagline was, "Talking about death won't kill you." But I think that some people are not quite convinced of
I
that.
think I want one for Christmas.
All right, I'm writing that down.
Yeah. Well, and that reminds me of another story. So a dear friend of mine was facing serious health challenges, and he had no will. And our San Francisco Public Library was offering free writing your own will workshops, and led by a lawyer. You could go in, if you'd given it some thought, you could come out with a completed, witnessed, durable will. And I forgot to sign up for it, and I showed up and I thought, oh, I'm not going to get let in because there's not going to be enough room. There was practically nobody there. And I said, why is that? And he said, because of magical thinking. People think that if they have a will in place, it's going to invite the Grim Reaper. And I was just incredulous. And so my friend ended up dying without a will, and havoc ensued.
Yeah.
So all of these pieces that are not the most fun, but they are absolutely necessary, and they're a gift to our loved ones, the people we leave behind. If we're leaving a big mess to mop up, it's going to color the grieving process. It's going to color the relationship. It's going to impact so much. So I think it's really important to know what needs to be done and to do the difficult work of doing it. Obviously, I could just wax on forever. Are there other topics I should try to address, or?
Well, it's really been an interesting conversation. And I'm sorry, Arlene had to leave. She was unable to really participate as fully as she wanted to, but I'm really excited to talk to her about her death in cupcakes and see what that looks like for, people in the Boise area that might be interested in learning more about this, talking more, having more discussions, because otherwise, how do you know? A lot of this information is opaque to most people. They just don't investigate it.
Well, and it is hard to find. And that is one of the reasons that I was so delighted that, Jim, you were willing to come in as a guest speaker for us for our series, because it is really hard to even find that education. And our commitment as Learn is to provide education on all topics, including the tough ones.
Yeah, especially the tough ones.
Well, I also think that it's interesting to think about retiring and like adding another layer onto your retirement plans. Oh, I'm going to move to California, or I'm going to move, somewhere where it's warm. But the reality is it's probably pretty important to look at what that state's laws are on self-deliverance and other important topics like that, in hospice. Even thank you very much for bringing up the piece about hospice operations being different and having different perspectives on self-deliverance, or even stopping eating, like and drinking, those things. So thank you. Really.
Well, and I appreciated your comments too on the healthcare power of attorney, and you would probably be interested in kind of I won't call it a movement yet, but several of my financial colleagues and I who feel strongly about this, and they do financial consulting. They actually, we have one member who calls it a rite of passage, and he believes that when someone turns 18, as a rite of passage, they should complete their healthcare power of attorney and be thinking about this as natural part of becoming an adult. And he guides his clients and their families and his own family that this is just part of adulting, and normalizing the conversation around healthcare power of attorney and living will from the beginning of being an adult. This is just responsible adulting, right?
Absolutely. And I have a friend who's a financial planner, and she does exactly the same thing. And so every year when she gets together with the person, she goes back in, okay, now last year you said this, is it still true? Would you sign this form? Just so that she has a paper trail of not even the financial, but also the medical wishes. And I remember another woman I met was was she a financial planner? No, she was helping people with their wills, and people would come into her office to go over this material, and they would say, well, if I die, if you die, And she and I got a chuckle out of that. We just, as human beings, we don't want to go there.
It's the great equalizer.
Yeah. But you might be interested in a new initiative that Final Exit Network is trying to get off the ground. We're calling it, what are we calling it? Chosen Death Forum, because oftentimes I get calls from people, where can I meet with like-minded people to talk about hastening my death or other aspects? And depending on where one is, and even then, how do you put those people together? So we're going to do a sort of modeled on the Death Cafe model, a virtual group where people can come and say, well, I was thinking about this. Oh, I know somebody who did that, and kind of demystify the option of considering to hasten one's own death. So it sounds like all the work that all of us are doing is really important, and hopefully moving the national conversation forward.
And making people aware of choices.
Right, because if they don't know what their choices are, and many people have talked to me and said, oh, I wish I had known about you when my parents were failing. Oh, this would have been so great. But we have a concept we call window of opportunity. And of course, no one wants to leave before they need to, but they also don't want to wait too long. So they need to have the physical ability and the cognitive ability to affect their own exit. And sometimes people have waited too long and missed that window, and it doesn't happen. So it's challenging. So anything else you think we should discuss?
I think that was really thorough. It's great having you here, Jim. This was just, getting the conversation. I think it's a conversation that's just so easy to avoid. Life has to force the conversation sometimes. And as you just said, your window of opportunity may be closed by the time your life is forcing you to have the conversation, or to actually think about it, or to put those pieces together. So really appreciate you taking the time. And at Final Exit Network looks like a fantastic resource that we can all dive into and find out more about educating ourselves and educating our loved ones. So much appreciation.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. It's a great organization, and everybody in it is compassionate and dedicated, and and thank you for all the wonderful work that you do. And if I can be of any other support, feel free to contact me.
Well, maybe you need to come back for
Okay.
another talk.
Happy
I think
to
it
do it.
would be great to do it. All right. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Great to meet you, and take care.
All right. I'm going to share my screen here. So once again, I'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight's webinar. We have Oasis Senior Advisors providing free personal senior living assistance, and A Mind for All Seasons. And without the help of these two sponsors, we have a hard time delivering this content free of charge, but we thank them so much. And especially thank you to Jim Van Buskirk from Final Exit Network. And also Jim's website is at jimvanbuskirk.com. You can read more about Jim there. So hope everyone has a lovely evening. And if you've attended, and all attendees and people who signed up will receive an email inviting you to join our mailing list. You can confirm your subscription and receive information about future free community education opportunities. So make sure you check your junk folder for that. And so our next webinar is regenerative medicine. And as you can see, we have a list of other really great content that you can sign up for, with more really wonderful speakers and presenters. And thank you all for attending, and the presentation will be posted to our website in the next few days. So make sure you get over to learnidaho.org, and you can find out more about our members and their expertise. And good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.